Hi there, my name is Matti Sulanto, and in this video I'm gonna show you how you can bracket exposure, aperture, focus and white balance on your Lumix camera. Most Lumix cameras have 4 or 5 bracketing options: exposure, aperture, focus and white balance. And then some cameras like the G9 or the S-series cameras, they also have another white balance bracketing option. However, some cameras, some lower end cameras like the GX880 don't have all these options. The GX880, for example, has only exposure and white balance bracketing. But then again, the LX100 Mark II has one unique bracketing option that none of the others have, and that's the aspect ratio bracketing. And I'm gonna cover all these bracketing options. And since there's quite a lot to cover, I think it's better we get started right away. Before I start talking about the bracketing itself, let's talk about the bracketing menu first. It's quite deep in the menu structure, and if you use it frequently, I think it's wise to add it to My Menu. Then you can access it quickly if you need it often. And I was talking about the customized or custom menus in this video, so please take a look if you're interested. You can also add bracketing to the quick menu, but in the quick menu you can't access all the options. You can choose which bracketing you want to use and you can turn it on and off, but you can't access all the extra options. So my recommendation is to add it to My Menu if you use it frequently, the bracketing that is. The first bracketing option is exposure bracketing, and I think exposure is by far the most common thing to bracket. But why would you even use exposure bracketing? Well, I think one reason is that you're not quite sure about the correct exposure. And by bracketing, you can be sure, or you want to make sure that you get the correct exposure. And another reason is that you want to make an HDR photo in post. You can of course make an HDR in camera, but if you want to have a bit more flexibility and control over the HDR, then you will shoot RAW and do the HDR processing in post in your favorite image editing application. And for that, you're gonna need 2 or more bracketed exposures. And let's see how you can perform exposure bracketing using your Lumix camera. First, of course, you're gonna go to the bracket menu and choose the first item on the list, and with the plus minus sign. That's the exposure bracketing. And then you choose, there's a tab called More, or submenu called More Settings. You go there and the first option is called the step. And there you can determine how many shots you want and what is the difference between each shot or frame. The options vary from 3 to 7 frames, and the exposure, like a gap or difference between frames, varies from third of a stop to full stop or one stop. Based on my experience, 3 frames with 1 stop exposure difference between them is sufficient in most situations. But since there are so many different types of shooting situations, it's impossible to say any number or recommendation that would be good for all situations. So you just have to experiment a little with these values and see what works for you. And the next item or submenu is called the sequence, and there you can choose in which order the frames are captured. If you choose the 0/-/+, the correct exposure is captured first, and then the underexposure, and then the overexposure. And the other exposure option is -/0/+. And in that option, the underexposure is captured first, then the correct exposure, and then the overexposure. And in my opinion, the second option is better. It's more logical. You first have the underexposure, then you have your correct exposure, and then you have the overexposed frames. And then there's one more option, and that's called the single shot setting. And there you can choose how the bracketed frames are captured. In the first option, if you choose that, you will have to press the shutter for each bracketed frame. And if you choose the second option, you press the shutter once and the camera captures all the bracketed frames at once, one after each other, but you only need to press the shutter once. In my opinion, the second option, where you only press the shutter once, is kind of easier to use. The way the exposure bracketing works depends on your selected shooting mode. There are some exceptions, and it would take way too long to explain them in detail, but as a rule of thumb it goes like this. If you are on manual mode, the exposure bracketing will bracket the shutter speed. And if you are on shutter speed priority, the bracketing will bracket the aperture. And if you are on aperture priority, the bracketing will bracket the shutter speed. And if you are on P program mode, the bracketing will use both the aperture and the shutter speed depending on the situation. And then if you have the auto ISO activated, that will come into play also in some situations. But if you are interested in this and you want to use bracketing, then spend maybe 15 minutes to figure out what's happening with each of these modes, and you'll be a lot wiser. It's also worth mentioning that if you're using exposure compensation, your correct exposure frame or your zero exposure frame is the frame where you start from. So if you have, for example, say +1 exposure compensation applied, then your zero or correct exposure frame is the one with the +1 correction, and the rest of the frames are bracketed around that frame. Also, there's no need for a tripod necessarily, especially if you're using relatively short shutter speed. The camera will take all the bracketed frames in a very quick burst, and you will get virtually identical framing in all frames if you have a steady hand. But of course, if you are making very precise HDR photo, then you want to use a tripod, of course. And the next bracketing option is the aperture. And let's first ask, why would you use aperture bracketing? Well, one reason can be that you're quite not sure how much depth of field you want. So you want to bracket your apertures just a bit to see which one looks best when you finally see your pictures on a big screen. And another reason could be that you just want to see how your lens performs at different apertures. I have a video where I talk about how to make sharp images. The video is up there. Please take a look if you're interested. In that video, I suggest you bracket your apertures and see which aperture is the sharpest and what kind of results you get at different apertures. And let's see how to do it. This is a lot simpler process than the exposure bracketing, and there are a lot less options. I did all my aperture bracketed shots on the Lumix S1R, but it works the same way on every Lumix camera that has this option. you want to start by going to the bracketing menu again, and then you choose the second option that has the F symbol. And then there's again the more settings tab or submenu, and in that you can choose how many apertures you want to bracket, 3, 5 or all. And you choose the number of apertures you want to bracket and you're all set. And if you chose all apertures, then you pretty much compose your frame or shot and focus wherever you want and hit the shutter, and the camera will take a picture at every aperture. But if you chose, let's say, 3 aperture bracketing, the camera will bracket around your chosen aperture. So let's say you start at 5.6, then the camera will take another picture at f8 and another picture at f4. And the aperture bracketing only works on manual mode and aperture priority mode. But if you're using manual mode, you have to have the auto ISO activated, and the camera will use the ISO to get the correct exposure at every aperture. And I wouldn't recommend using manual exposure for this bracketing, because at small apertures you can end up with really high ISO photos that may not look that good. But if you use aperture priority and do not activate the auto ISO, you will get really nice results. But my recommendation is to use a tripod, because at very, very small apertures like f22, the exposure time can be quite long depending on the lighting, of course. And here are some examples that I shot on the S1R. I bracketed all apertures from f4 to f22. I had my camera on a tripod and my ISO was fixed to ISO 50. And also don't forget to sign up for my monthly newsletter. There's a link in the description, but you can also go to my website sulanto.fi to do that. Thanks. And the next up is the focus bracketing. And the only reason I can figure out for focus bracketing is that you want to do a focus stacking in post. You can do focus stacking in most Lumix cameras in the camera, but if you want to have a bit more control over the end result and you want to shoot raw, then you will use the focus bracketing, shoot raw, and do the stacking in post in your favorite image editing application. And let's see how to do it. I shot all my focus bracketed photos on the Lumix G90, but it works the same way on every Lumix camera that has this option. First you of course go to the bracketing menu again, and then you choose the focus, of course, that is the third option. And then there's again the more settings submenu. You go there and the first option is called the step. And there you determine how big is the focus step from one frame to another. That's just a number, and it's almost impossible to say any correct number or recommendation here, because it depends on your lens, it depends on which aperture you are shooting at, and then it depends on the shooting distance. So there are so many variables, and it also depends on a little bit on the subject too. So there are so many variables that you just simply have to experiment a little bit. I have one example in a moment that I will show you how I did that, and maybe that helps you. And the next option is the image count. That's obvious. You choose how many pictures you wanna bracket. And the next option is the sequence. The first one is 0/-/+, but I wouldn't recommend that, because in my opinion the pictures come out in really weird order. And the second option is 0/+. In my opinion the second option is much more logical, because the camera starts from your focus point, wherever that is, and then it starts to focus gradually further away from that. So you will get a really nice logical series of pictures focused from near to far. I guess it's possible to do this handheld, but I strongly recommend a tripod. And you only need to press the shutter once. The camera will take all the necessary shots or the frames after you press the shutter only once. And here's one sample of a 14mm spanner. I used the G90 camera and the 45mm macro lens. I shot at f8 and my bracketing options were +3 and 40 frames. But in the end I noticed that only about 28 frames were necessary. More than 10 frames were out of focus because the camera focused behind my subject. But the end result looks pretty good. I forgot to take a picture at f22, so you just have to take my word for it that even at f22 there was not enough depth of field to cover the whole spanner. So pretty much the only way to get a picture like this would be focus stacking and focus bracketing. And the next one is the white balance bracketing. And this only works with JPEGs, which makes sense. If you shoot RAW, you can do pretty much whatever you want with your white balance in post. But a JPEG file is not as nearly as flexible as a RAW file. And the reason to bracket the white balance is of course a situation where you can't be quite sure what would be the correct white balance. For example, artificial mixed lighting situations can be like that. They can be tricky for the auto white balance, and it can be a little bit difficult to tell from the camera screen or the viewfinder if the white balance is correct or the way you want it. So it can make sense to bracket, and then when you see your pictures on a big screen, then you can kind of decide which one looks the best. And let's see how it works. Again, you go to the bracketing menu and there you choose the fourth option, which is WB, white balance. And there you have again the more settings submenu, and there you can choose how you bracket the white balance. You can bracket either on magenta green axis or amber blue axis. And once you've selected that, then you're all set. And when you have the white balance bracketing activated, the camera will only take one picture, but you will end up with 3 different versions of that same frame. And it's very nice if you have a decisive moment in that frame. You will have 3 versions of that same exact frame. So it's a bit different than all the previous bracketing options, where the camera actually takes more than one different frames. And here's one sample photo that I shot on the G9 under mixed artificial light. I used the auto white balance and I bracketed the maximum values along the magenta green axis. And some Lumix cameras like the G9 and also the S1R have also another white balance bracketing option. It works the same way as the option I was just talking about, but this one uses, it's a bit more precise, and it uses the color temperature and the Kelvin degrees. And this only works with the Kelvin white balance presets. First you have to select your Kelvin preset you want and set the color balance how you want. And then you go back to the bracketing menu and choose the bracketing value, and you can choose between ±100 to 500 Kelvin degrees. You can also activate this and all other white balance bracketing options in the white balance menu. And here's one sample photo that I shot on the G9. My Kelvin preset was 3600 and I bracketed the maximum ±500 kelvins. And like I already said, The white balance bracketing makes a lot of sense if you're shooting in artificial light or in some mixed lighting, because in those situations it can be really difficult to determine the best white balance at the time of hitting the shutter. And then there's the aspect ratio bracketing that's unique for the LX100 Mark II. And to be honest, I don't remember if the Mark I version has the same option. This camera has so-called multi-aspect ratio. And the aspect ratios are 3:4, 1:1, 16:9, and 3:2. And if you want to capture all these aspect ratios at once, you need to use the aspect ratio bracketing. And this only works with JPEG. And this one's pretty simple. You just go again to the bracket menu and choose the last option, which has this like many frames kind of symbol. And you choose that, and there's no more settings. You just activate that, and that's it. You're good to go. And then on the screen or in the viewfinder, you will see these guide lines or these rectangulars that will show you all the different framings that you're gonna get. And then you just hit the shutter, and in this case also the camera takes only one frame. So this is good for street photography or anything where you want to capture that decisive moment. You get the camera will only take one frame, but you will end up with 4 different framings. You may want to ask, what's the point of all this? Why not just have one like a picture that uses the whole full sensor area, and then you can crop whatever you want from that? Well, it's not that simple with this camera, because the image circle of the lens is smaller than the sensor. So if you would have that kind of picture that would have all these aspect ratios in one picture, it would look like this. The corners are missing because the image circle doesn't cover the whole sensor. So it makes sense to let the camera do the cropping. So that's it, quite a lot of bracketing. But I hope this is helpful for you guys, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.